This is a society that was driven by entertainment. Do not we see the same today? If you feed people enough food and entertainment, they will totally neglect how their government is ran. They will be distracted by entertainment that they do not notice that their liberties are slowly being taken away from them. The Bible warns us over and over and over again of the dangers of a lack of sobriety, the high cost, the very high cost of distraction. So then in the Roman Empire, as well as in modern day America, wars and taxes and atrocities by the federal government take place every day, but we are distracted by bread and circuses. Give us our WWE, give us our UFC, give us our NFL, give us our gladiators, give us our modern day gladiators. Give us those men that will entertain us by their destruction, by their own bodies being destroyed. What was the Colosseum used for? We'll start with the lighter and go to the darker. Plays, concerts, even zoos were popular. Much like today when you go to the US Bank Stadium, you can have a football game or Taylor Swift in concert that will draw 70,000 fans, screaming fans. The great games, which often lasted for entire weeks, were a strange mixture of the comic and the tragic. The jovial, says one, and the horrible. A favorite amusement was to witness the acting of trained animals in the circus. The writers of those days tell us of an elephant that was a rope walker, of a bear which sat in a chair dressed as a matron, which was carried around the arena by attendants. Then we have an account of the king of the forest, with gilt claws and mane, bespangled with gold and precious stones, which as a strange contrast to successive scenes was made to represent the virtue of clemency, being trained to play with a hare. They taught lions and tigers to play with rabbits, to hold them in their mouth, to play with them. And all the 70,000 or 100,000 fans from each level, all walks of life, would sit and be entertained and watch that, distracted from the day, distracted from the terrors of the kingdom, distracted from the terrors of the empire. He would take the frightened little animal and put it in his mouth, put it on his back, and lavish on it 1,000 caresses. Then we read of 12 tame elephants, 6 male and 6 female, dressed in togas of men and women. They dressed their animals like humans, who would sit at a table and eat delicate foods and drink wine from golden cups, and would use the greatest delicacy and care that extraordinary trunk, that they could lift a pin from the ground or tear the forest oak from its roots. Others were trained to the Pyrrhic dance and would spread flowers on the arena. They had a peculiar strong drink to which the elephants were partial. They literally got their elephants drunk and caused them to go through antics and maneuvers that produced roars of laughter and from the spectators. You might wonder, how in the world do people have time to watch elephants get drunk? Bread and circuses, distractions from reality. How many people today waste copious amounts of time on video games, movies, sports, following their favorite teams, entertainment? Constantly, their lives are consumed with it. This is the Colosseum. Ships with armed men were floated. They literally flooded the Colosseum with water. The bottom level, the hypogeum, with water, flooded it with water, built warships, and had them fight with each other to the death. Ships with armed men, said one, were floated and fought desperately with each other, as if an empire depended on the issue of the battle. On one occasion, a large ship was introduced to this artificial lake, full of men and animals, and at any given signal, it opened its sides and fell to pieces, casting its living freight into the waters. Then came all the horrors of a shipwreck. They literally mimicked a shipwreck. The screams from animals and the piteous cries of drowning slaves sounded like music to the Roman ear. It was not fake, it was real. It was staged, but it was real in front of them. They watched people drowned, brought to their death, animals drowned, simply for entertainment. The arena in the center of which stood the statue of Jupiter formed a stage and derived its name from being usually strewed with the finest white sand. Underneath it, they had a mechanism of the most extraordinary and great and complicated character, so that the arena could, during the games, assume different forms in quick successions. At one time, it would seem to rise up out of the earth like the Garden of Eden. It could just rise up, the floor could, and be an entire garden paradise before their eyes. And it was afterward broken. Subterranean pipes conveyed an inexhaustible supply of water. They had literally built a plumbing system underneath the Colosseum that would deliver water into there and flood the entire bottom of that stadium. Then they could open the hatch and they could let all the water drain out. Archaeologists have used that area down there to dig and to find different things. For instance, they found out what those people ate at the Colosseum, what their food was, what their drink was, what they did, the different things that they've found there. How did they do that? By digging through the dirt and finding the remains through that water supply, and where that water would go out, finding the remains of what was there underneath that Colosseum. By a combination of mechanical skill, the fable of Orpheus was almost realized. The soil of the arena was made to open suddenly in 100 pieces and 100 places, and trees would spring up clothed in the deepest green foliage and bearing the golden apples in imitation of the fabulous trees of the garden. Wild animals were let loose into the enchanting forest. The trees would move to the sound of a flute. Think about that. They bring these animals into this garden. They have a literal garden. Where are the people of Rome going to ever see a zoo like that or a garden like that? They're going to see it at the Colosseum. It kept them from spreading out and going to different areas and looking at those things. How is it today with people? AI and generated things cause them to look at things simply through a screen, but never to experience life, never to go to those places. Why? Because they're distracted. What is AI and VR going to do, and virtual reality and all of these things that are coming? Immersive technology. What is it doing? It's designing you to see those things and be pacified by those things in your own mind instead of going out and looking at those things and living life in the world today. Not much has changed. The technology has gotten better, but it's still the same thing. But lighthearted entertainment was not enough. The human mind grows darker and darker with idleness. See, they crave the spectacular. They are thrill seekers. They are pleasure seekers. There is never enough for people. Once you are driven by entertainment and not by real purpose and truth, by God Almighty, you'll be given over to that entertainment, and it will never be good enough. It will never be scary enough. You will never live on the edge enough. How many people have died on filming YouTube videos, fallen off the Grand Canyon, fallen down out of things like that? Why? Because they're thrill seekers, they're pleasure seekers. It's never enough. They grow upon it, they build upon it. They have to walk on the edge of things, and they have to fall off of those things, and people crash and die. Why? Because they're pleasure seeking.
Disaster on this scary stretch of road popular with tourists and known as one of the most dangerous in America. Now it has claimed new victims. 2 nurses and their tour guide driver killed after their Jeep plunged over a cliff along Camp Bird Road in the Colorado mountains.
2 daredevils were killed over the weekend attempting a stunt while base jumping, which is skydiving off a fixed object. This time it was a cliff in Yosemite National Park, but they collided with a rocky outcrop on the way down. Ben Tracy tells us one of the men was a legend among thrill seekers.
3, 2, 1, see ya.
This is Dean Potter base jumping in a wingsuit last year. His dog Whisper strapped on his back.
We're learning a social media stunt gone wrong led to the death of a teenager at the 6th Street Bridge.
They're pleasure seekers. They're not God seekers. They don't seek the Lord. They don't seek the truth of God's word, but they are given over to entertainment. Idle people who are not building anything productive will only be satisfied with violence. See, that was the next step. It wasn't enough to entertain them with animals, with zoos, with seemingly harmless things. No. They craved more. And the emperors would do anything they could to put on the greatest show in all the earth. They had to. Because the more popular they were, the more people would be behind them and back them, and the more they would not uprise. The people that are pacified will not rise up against their captors. Nothing might be wanting to the reality of the representation. The unfortunate slave who had the honor of representing Orpheus in that garden, in that structure, was torn to pieces by a bear. Real, not actors. The show must go on, and it must be spectacular, or it is a slight to the Pontifex Maximus. It is a slight to the Caesar. If things didn't go right, somebody died. If the show was not pleasing to the people, someone died. They killed him for it. A failure in any of these mechanisms, says one, of these shows was considered a slight to the emperor, and the director was punished with public death. They killed him in front of everybody. Were it not for the inhumane and barbarous custom, which cramped with fear the greatest genius of the empire, the Colosseum would have witnessed many great triumphs of mechanical art. That's a quote from someone, and the reason they said that is because when you look at the Colosseum, how spectacular it was back then and the things that were recorded of that, what you find out is many talented men were put to death because they had one bad show. So their creativity, the spectacular performances that we're able to put on, the mechanics that they were able to put into it, they destroyed and killed their own ingenuity. Reminds you of the communist government of China, how they murder their own people, their own citizens if they don't do what they want. They put them to death. They're most talented people if they don't follow the king, if they don't worship the king, if they don't worship the leader. Same thing happened there. If they are slighted, the leader is slighted. We underestimate the power of entertainment. Think about how many WWE wrestlers, NFL players, UFC players, UFC fighters die at a young age. Football players that mangle their own bodies. And UFC athletes that destroy their bodies so the show goes on and the fans are pleased.
As we head into the big game weekend, many of us are obviously thinking about football. And with the intensity of play in the NFL, quick action by on-field medical staff can save lives. DeMar Hamlin is just one example of that.
And as West 2's Scott Heidler tells us, fast work by Melbourne High School team's trainer probably saved a player's life. He spoke with them both today.
Being a receiver on the Melbourne High School football team meant everything to 18-year-old Ryan Cabrera. But an injury put his life in jeopardy.
How bad is football for the brain? A new study from the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at the brains of more than 200 diseased former football players, including more than 100 who played in the NFL. Mark Martin has this story.
Hard-hitting numbers today in a new study about football and head trauma. 99% of the brains of former NFL players studied were damaged. Out of 111 brains examined, all but one had CTE, the disease caused by repeated blows to the head. Symptoms include emotional instability, depression, and memory loss. Doctors now say the brain damage is more common than previously thought, and more work should be done to detect and treat it in its earliest stages. The NFL says it's pledged $200 million for research in the prevention and treatment.
There are new concerns about football injuries after another tough hit in the NFL overnight. There you see Brandon Williams from the Colts. Helmet-on-helmet hit. He was taken off the field with concussion. And now former NFL star Larry Johnson speaking out in an ABC News exclusive. Johnson's 38, convinced he's living with CTE as he battles memory loss, anxiety, and suicidal impulses.
All right, some unfortunate news tonight from the Indiana Pacers. The team announced today that guard Benedict Mathurin will miss the rest of his season. Mathurin has been diagnosed with a torn labrum in his right shoulder and will have to have surgery for it. Our sports team is going to have much more on that developing story coming up later in sports.
Amongst the spectacular founded on pagan mythology. These spectacles were founded upon paganism, heathenism. This isn't Christian. The poet Martial makes mention in his epigrams of a parent who was crucified in the Colosseum right before everybody. Also of a horrible scene of Daedalus raised in the air with false wings and then permitted to fall in the arena where he was devoured by wild animals. On another occasion, a slave was brought to represent Mutius Scavello and to put his hand into a fire until it completely burned. The wretch who had to suffer this awful cruelty had another alternative, for his garments were covered with pitch and tar, and if he wavered or flinched for a moment, he was burned alive. So either he stuck his hand in there and had his hand burnt and melted off, or they already had his body covered in pitch. They would light him on fire and destroy him and burn him alive in front of everybody. It was an insatiable thirst for violence that could not be quenched. So it was in the Roman Colosseum. It is seen the modern day equivalent of the WWE or the UFC or the NFL. Gladiators lined up to battle each other to the death or to be maimed or paralyzed for millions of dollars in order to be the world champion gladiator. Now, during the greater celebrations, there was scarcely a day passed in which some hundreds of mangled carcasses of men and beasts were not dragged from the arena to what they called the spoliarium, or the dead house. The games commenced about 10 in the morning and often lasted till dark. During all these hours, victim was felling upon victim. The spectators, more and more intoxicated with each new draught of blood, drunk in by their glistening eyes, yelled for fresh victims and more blood. Imagine 80,000 people screaming in delight as men are falling in front of them to their death. This is not a war. This is not a battle of nations. It's their own people or slaves that they brought in, that they treated like animals and destroyed them. The spectators more and more intoxicated with blood. Nothing was good enough. Nothing was enough. It had to be more and more and more. On more than one occasion, it happened that every animal in the vivarium was slain in one day. Imagine grabbing these tigers and these lions from Africa and these other places. They had to import them from all over the world. So imagine them importing and bringing those animals from all over the world just to bring them in to the Colosseum to slaughter them before men's eyes. But animal blood wasn't enough. It was bloodlust and violence that drove their carnal natures. They had no pity when they entered the arena. They had no compassion. We're reminded of Genesis chapter 6, verse 11. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Violence. Eutropius, speaking of Titus, says this: and when he had built the amphitheater of Rome, he inaugurated the games and caused 5,000 beasts to be slain. We can't even fathom seeing 5,000 beasts. But they brought 5,000 beasts to the Colosseum and destroyed them before men's eyes to inaugurate their games. Gladiators, slaves, and Christians were the principal victims of the games. Scores of fans scream for their teams today, just like they did in the Colosseum. As men battled each other to the death or to the knockout. No entertainment was popular, said one, unless accompanied by bloodshed and loss of life. No mock tragedies would be cheered in this temple of furies. The amusements of the Colosseum formed the darkest page in the records of the past. But by far the most common amusement of the Colosseum, the one that it's known for, that everyone talks about, movies are made about, great productions and grand reproductions have been done, were the combats with the beasts and the gladiators. The wild animals were made to fight with each other, then with men, and lastly, man with his fellow man. When wild animals were put into the arena to fight with each other, everything that could rouse or excite them was studied with the most cruel skill. They studied what would anger those beasts so they could be as angry as the beast could possibly be for a performance. They literally provoked those animals. Imagine provoking a lion. We talk about poking a bear, right? Don't poke the bear. They poked the bear. That's what they did. The colors they hated were scattered in profusion around them. They were beaten with whips, and their sides were torn with iron hooks. Hot plates of iron were fastened to those animals, and even balls of fire were placed on their backs. Thus, the enraged animals would run round the arena. The earth would tremble under the thunder of their agonizing roars, and the inflated chests would seem to burst under the fire of passion that drove them to madness. If, as sometimes happened, an infuriating lioness or tigress should kill the men and animals presented to her, frantic shouts of applause rose from every side of the amphitheater. And whilst mistress of the battlefield, she walked over the bodies of her victims, the people cried aloud for her liberty, to have her sent back again to her native deserts. Don't kill the lion. They were more willing to spare the lion or the animal or the tiger than they were for men or women or even children. They cared more for the life of that lion than they did for them. Life was so devalued by them in the Colosseum. They cared nothing for it. Good question to ask yourself is, how far are we away from this today? Arenas full of fans screaming as men beat each other to a pulp in the UFC. Knockouts in boxing. Loud crowds in the dopamine rush. The combats between men and beasts were still more popular. The emperors themselves used to take part in them. And even women had the hardihood to enter the arena, said one, and combat the most ferocious animals. So imagine a woman dressed like an Amazonian running into the amphitheater, running down into there and fighting animals. Even their women did leave the natural use. Even their women did leave the gentle nature in which they had. There was something hypnotizing about the Colosseum. As soon as they entered in and they heard the roar of the fans and they heard the screaming and the roar of lions, they wanted to be heroes. They all wanted to be heroes. So even their women would run into the arena and fight with a ferocious animal. They would send their sons and daughters to their death. There were two classes of people destined for this species of sport. One was armed. They carried weapons according to their choice. They were trained killers, trained in weaponry. They had a school of gladiators connected to the Colosseum, that they would take the tunnels into the Colosseum. There was a school of gladiators that were there that would train up gladiators to fight. Just like the UFC has schools of fighting and training facilities for their fighters, same thing, no different. One class carried weapons according to their choice. The others were poor slaves, captives, criminals, AKA Christians. Many of them were Christians who were exposed to defenseless. They were exposed to beast in a most defenseless manner. They had no way to defend themselves. To this class, the Christians belonged. They were distinguished from the gladiators by the opprobrious title of bestiaries. They were going to be the food for the beasts. Literally. We count the Roman Empire, that beastly kingdom. Right? We see a resurgence of the Roman Empire, the revived Roman Empire under Pontifex Maximus, the Caesars today, who murdered and killed Christians all through the centuries. And in there, they were just food for the beasts. The pagan beliefs of Rome led to more bloodshed in that self-proclaimed eternal city. The combat of gladiators is supposed to have been Etruscan in origin. It formed part of the funeral rites of great men, according to the pagan beliefs that the shades of manes of the dead were appeased by the shedding of blood. This strange funeral rite was introduced into Rome by Junius Brutus in the year 490 of the city, and about 260 years before the Christian era, it is called. It seems to have been so pleasing to the cruel taste of the Roman people as to have soon become a common pastime, the gladiatorial fight. They were strictly speaking the games of the Colosseum, and to these it owes its existence. So intense was the excitement of the people during these fights that they seemed to lose all self-control from morning until evening, careless of cold or heat. We've watched it, haven't we? Look outside of the US Bank Stadium. Look outside of the stadiums of the world. How many people will stand outside there in the cold, in the rain, in the freezing? We go out and preach outside of these events. Outside of the US Bank Stadium, we are covered with layer upon layer of clothes. These people are standing outside there with nearly nothing on, willing to cheer on their favorite team, dressed in all the garb of a fanatic, dressed in whatever their team colors are, dressed to represent their favorite gladiators, willing to suffer whatever it takes to get the tickets they want, to stand in line as long as they need to.
Fans traded in their 7-layer dip for 7 layers of warmth to attend the Chiefs-Dolphins playoff game.
So cold. I mean, unbelievably cold. I couldn't tell you how cold it is.
Layer. How many layers do you have on?
I have 5 layers on.
Bibs. I got about 6 on the top, 3 or 4 on the bottom, and about 3 pairs of socks.
Fans of both teams slowly filled the parking lots, fired up to be there.
No, not cold at all. We're here. We're having fun at the tailgate. Chiefs fans are...
Teams fought to continue in the postseason. The fans fought to stay warm.
It was a critical wild card win for the Kansas City Chiefs, but for some fans in the stands, the January 13th game was a life and body-altering event. A local medical center reporting some patients who braved the frigid temperatures to watch the Chiefs defeat the Miami Dolphins needed amputations due to frostbite.
Careless of cold or heat, they were. They gazed with mad excitement on the arena, and their minds were agitated with the fluctuating passions of hope and fear. Like the ocean tossed by contrary winds, nor was the demon of discord idle while the flurries flapped their funeral wings over the bloody scenes of the Colosseum. The spectators were divided in several parties. Sharp and bitter discussions concerning the rival merits of the combatants formed, said one, in an inexhaustible source of broils and disputes. So the fans began to fight each other. Much like now, haven't we not seen whole cities burned, cars destroyed, vandalism all over the city when their favorite team wins or loses? Fights that break out, fans that get into fights with each other because one is a green team and one is a blue team, right? They get angry with each other. They're willing to go to fists. They're willing to fight. They're willing to hurt each other. They're willing to harm each other over their team winning or not winning, or somebody saying something against their team. Sharp and bitter discussions would take place. Rival merits of the combatants formed an inexhaustible source of fights and disputes, and sometimes they became so excited as to pass from criticism and argument to blows, and even to deadly weapons, until the breaches of the amphitheater from end to end became the scene of tumult and massacre. They fought to the death. The fans sometimes fought to the death. The fans sometimes destroyed each other and killed each other over the fury of the Colosseum, the hypnotizing of the Colosseum, that strange demon of entertainment, that detainment of the mind that takes place when the mind is completely detained and taken over to be entertained. Such was the rage of the people of these sites. That is believed that 100,000 gladiators fell within its walls. During 12 days, Trajan made as many as 10,000 gladiators fight successively. Almost all the succeeding emperors followed his example. One emperor built upon another emperor, and had to outdo that emperor to make a name for himself. The men who fought as gladiators were generally captives taken in their war of slaves. At a later period, it became a kind of profession. So it grew. At first, they were just slaves that were forced in the Colosseum. Then it grew into a job. Then it grew into a career of fame and fortune. At a later period, they became professional gladiators, maddened by enthusiasm. They are said to have entered the list to fight in deadly combat with the poor captives from Thrace and Gaul. Even women appeared in the arena as Amazons and fought frantically and bravely amid the unceasing acclamations of the people. So, the women fighters. Now what do you have in UFC? You have transgender fighters. You have women fighters. You have women fighting men, right? You have them combating men. You have scenes in the WWE, which I watched when I was a child. It was called the WWF. And I watched it, and women would come and fight men, and full-grown men would stage beating the women up, and the women would stage fighting with the men, dressed in hardly nothing to attract the most men they could. Not much different. They mimic the Colosseum. Think about ladies running out like madmen into the Colosseum to entertain the masses, to hear the roaring of the crowds. How is it that this fair sex of ours, the women, someone's little girl, ended up volunteering themselves to fight like a wild Amazonian woman in the Colosseum, to face down lions and tigers and full-grown men to destroy them? Even an emperor entered in to the arena in a rigged or staged event. Historians tell us, Herodian and Lampridius, that the emperor Commodus, not content with witnessing the fights of the gladiators, entered the arena himself, almost naked and armed with a short sword, and he would challenge them to combat. Those who contended with him were enjoined, they were warned, do not inflict any wound upon Caesar. But the moment they received a slight wound, they fell on their knees before Caesar. And declaring themselves defeated, they sued and begged for mercy. Having thus defeated 1,000 gladiators by a staged event, the Emperor Commodus, he ordered the head to be taken from the colossal statue of the sun and his own image placed in its stead. On the base of the monument, he put his inscription, Mille Gladiatorium Victor, the conqueror of 1,000 gladiators. To prove the heathen origins of such debauched entertainment, we are told that after the procession of the gods, with which the games of the amphitheater, as well as those of the circus, were commenced. Think about this for a second. What did they do? They had a commencement and a procession to the gods before the event. They hit the music. They bowed to the images, like is talked about by Nebuchadnezzar when he set up his golden image. Or how about now? They'll play things like the national anthem before these games. They'll play things. They'll have a procession in the Olympics. They have rituals to false gods in the Olympics that begin their games, that inaugurate their games. No different. They did the same thing in the Colosseum. The gladiators who were doomed to fight were also led around the arena in procession. So they would lead them around, kind of like the entrance music. When they're entering the Colosseum, when they're entering the battle. In the WWF, they have entered into the music. They have them entered in with music into the Colosseum, into the arenas all over the world. Madison Square Gardens. I remember when I was a kid, men like Hulk Hogan and other people like that would come into entrance music, and all these thousands of fans would be watching everywhere. While their music was hitting, the fans would scream and go wild. Same thing in the Colosseum. As a prelude to the battle, and to create the proper pitch of excitement, they fought first with wooden swords. They built them up fighting with wooden swords. Then upon a signal, being given the sound of a trumpet, these were laid aside and deadly weapons were substituted. They gave them their weapons of death. The interests of the assembled thousands was soon carried to the highest pitch of excitement. From time to time, they burst into deafening shouts of applause, or a dread silence reigned throughout the vast amphitheater, a suspense which only ended in the death of one of the combatants. All 80,000 would silence themselves as they would choose up or down, for the gladiator to be killed or to be spared, for the animal to be killed or to be spared, for the woman to be killed or to be spared. Proverbs 18:21. Proverbs 18:21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof." Death. Death was on their hearts. Destruction was on their hearts. Men and women of corrupt minds, desensitized to the plight of their fellow men. The Bible tells us that the love of many shall wax cold in these end times. And cold were these entertainment-driven, devil-possessed people. So much so it is said by one that sometimes the wounded wretch would endeavor to conceal his wound, or pretend that it was no account, and perhaps would fall to the ground, to making his last and desperate rush on his adversary. But his fate depended on the pleasure of the people. If they wished him to be saved, they pressed down their thumbs, and if to be slain, they turned them up. The latter was more generally the awful verdict of the unfeeling mob. The cry of "Recipe Ferrum" would fall with a terrible vehemence on the dying man's ears. This simply meant that he was to submit to his fate bravely and with dignity, and that he should show no disgraceful writhings or contortions of pain, and that he should have even an art in the awful agonies of death. So in other words, these people, 70,000, 80,000 fans in the arena, are voting for this man to be slaughtered, and they want not to see him do anything that would make him look like a coward, but that he's to take his death with a smile on his face and die, and act as if it bothered him not. Death was the verdict for most. The people, says Seneca, thought themselves insulted when he would not die willingly, and by look, by gesture, and by vehemence of manner, called for his immediate execution. So, if the man would not die willingly, they would force, by vehemence of manner, they would force and call an executioner to put him to death in front of them. See, the pagans had turned the shedding of human blood into a pastime. These heathens. So totally has humanity receded from men's breasts, said one, that they make their amusement consist in abetting murder and sacrificing human life. How many times in our own modern day Colosseums of the WWE, UFC, NFL do we find fans cheering when a man is knocked unconscious or taken off the field in a stretcher? Now I ask, said one, can those be called just and pious, who not only permit the slaughter of one who lies prostrate under the drawn sword, supplicating for life, but who demand that he be murdered, who give their cruel and inhumane suffrages for death, not satiated with the wounds and gore of their hapless victim? Good question. Nay, when stretched dead before them on the sand, they command the lifeless and bleeding body to be stabbed over and over again and cut and mangled lest they be diluted by a sham homicide. They wanted to make sure he was dead. So slaughter him in front of us. Give him many blows to make sure there's nothing left of his body, that it's nothing but a limping corpse with no life in it. They wanted to see all the blood shed. They get furious with the combatants who did not quickly dispatch each other. And as if they thirsted for human blood, are impatient of delay. Each company of newcomers, as it pours into the circles, vociferates for fresh victims, that they may satiate their eyes. Thus, duels and combats by groups and melees of the most terrible slaughter passed like whirlwinds under the frenzied gaze of the people. For hours and even days, the arena of the Colosseum was reeking with the blood of its victims. Its sickening vapors would ascend to the pure air of heaven, as from an immense cauldron of cruelty and pleasure. The smell of blood reeked out of the Colosseum for days. Imagine being there and the smell of blood filling your nostrils. You say, how could they? How could they be so cruel? A society without natural affection is capable of anything, even their women. Bloodlust, entertainment, and the sight of slaughter can dement a mind so badly to leave it never the same again. Even religious people were not immune to such evil. The Bible warns us, mine eye affecteth my heart. God warns us to keep our heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. We are to guard our eyes and our hearts and our minds from evil. We are not to behold evil and look upon violence and entertain ourselves on violence. The scriptures exhort us and command us to set no unclean thing before our eyes. Now, a gripping story by Augustine. A story of a man who looked on evil and was seduced by it. You say, how could a man do this? Most men should be completely, that should abhor them. They should hate those things. Augustine gives us in the 6th book of his Confessions a singularly vivid description of the excitement that prevailed among the spectators during these sanguinary struggles. It happens, he says, while his friend Alypius was studying the law at Rome, that he was met one day by some of his friends, and they were walking after dinner, and they insisted on taking him through the Colosseum. For it is one of the dismal holidays when Rome took its pleasure in these spectacles of human slaughter. As Alypius had an extreme horror of this kind of cruelty, naturally, he at first resisted with all of his might. But resorting to that sort of violence which is sometimes permitted among friends, they jested him, they poked him, they prodded him, they dragged him along. While he repeated, "You may drag my body along with you and place me amongst you in the amphitheater, but you cannot dispose of my mind, nor of my eyes, which shall not, most assuredly, take any part in this spectacle. I shall be absent, therefore, although present in body, and thus I shall render myself superior to the violence you practice on me and to the passion by which you are possessed." But he might as well have been silent. They drew him along, having a mind perhaps to see if he could be as good as his word. They wanted to see, can he really resist the Colosseum? Can he resist the entertainment of the Colosseum? At length they arrived, and they placed themselves as best they could. And while all the amphitheater was in transports with these barbarous pleasures, Alypius guarded his heart from taking any part in them, keeping his eyes shut. He literally closed his eyes and covered them so he would not see what was going on in the amphitheater. And would to God, continues Augustine, he had also stopped his ears. Because it's not only the eyes that are affected, it's the ears that are affected by what we hear. For having been struck by a great and universal shout, which was caused among the people by something extraordinary that had occurred in the combat, he was seized with curiosity, and merely wishing to ascertain what it could be, persuaded that, no matter what it was, he would hate it and despise it and would not look at it. He opened his eyes, though, and in so doing inflicted on his own soul a wound more fatal than that which one of the gladiators had just received in his body. It was this occasion, and that occasion of a fall, far more dangerous than that of the unfortunate gladiator that was put to his death. Because that was what overthrew his own conscience and his mind. The inhumane shout which had tempted him to open his eyes, cruelty entered into his heart. The blood, which at the same moment was pouring on the arena, met his eyes. And very far from turning them away, he kept them riveted to the spot, drinking in long draughts of fury without perceiving it, and allowing himself to be intoxicated with the criminal pleasure. He was no longer the same Alypius. He had been dragged there by force. He was a man of the same stamp as those who made up the crowd of the amphitheater, and a fit companion for those who brought him there. He looked on, he shouted, mingling his cries with theirs, feverish with excitement, and like them, totally absorbed in the vicissitudes of the combat. In fine, he departed from the amphitheater with such a passion for these sights that he could think of nothing else. Not only was he ready to return with those who had been obliged to use force with him in the first instance to bring him to the Colosseum, but he was more infuriated about the gladiators than they, drawing others with him and ever ready to lead the way to the amphitheater. So the intense was the excitement of the people during these fights. It's what drew them in. Alypius never thought that he would look at that. He never thought that he would ever go there. He got there. He never thought that he would look at it, but he heard it before he saw it. And once his eyes were affected, his eyes were affected. And he never lost the thirst and the drive and the hunger for the violence that was before him. So intense was the excitement of these people during these fights that they seemed to lose all self-control. From morning till evening, careless or cold, they would look and they would gaze upon it. They would not walk away from it until the games were over. You know, the Bible says evil communication corrupts good manners. He had some good manners and he was corrupted by them, by the evil communication. All of these fans would camp out with excitement to the pitch of rage. You know, remains of food had been found in the Colosseum, where the drains were plugged. They found out. They ate chicken legs, pork, olives, nuts, and melons. They played dice, they rolled dice, they gambled, knuckle bones, and clay counters. Their clay counters were the same thing that you would have in sports cards. When people trade baseball cards, or they trade football cards, or they traded all those things, that's the same thing. They had their own. They had their own clay counters. Fighting at the football games. We've seen that, haven't we? Fighting at games and riots. Benches cleared. Colosseum was no different. One said it this way: nor was the demon of discord idle whilst the Furies flapped their funeral wings over these bloody scenes. They saw them. They were enraged by them. We have an account of these fans that went crazy. One of these terrible scenes was at the Circus Maximus, not too far away from the Colosseum, in which upwards of 30,000 persons were killed or wounded. Something similar happened in the Colosseum on the occasion of a scene of horrible cruelty. The people who reveled in the scenes of bloodshed were men as we are. You wonder what type of men could do this? Men like us. Men that you go to work with. Women that you see. Mothers holding a baby. Grandmothers. You often think about that. Who could do such things? Right? But when I stood outside of a church a year ago, I watched an old grandmother bragging about two of her sons that were homosexuals, and then bragging about going into a drag queen story time, celebration and dance in a church with children. These are people that you go to church with. These are people that you work with. These are people that you see at the store. These are the same people that would enter the Colosseum and totally lose all sense of humanity and decency and normalcy. When they entered the Colosseum, all decency was swallowed up by the loud applause, the roaring lions, and the frenzy of bloodshed. All of men's nobler traits were surrendered to the Colosseum's entertainment. The people who reveled in these scenes of bloodshed were men like you. Then, as they are now, the heart was capable of noble feelings. There were in the Colosseum, witnessing its cruel games, senators who could sit with honor in the British Parliament, poets who would return to their homes immediately after the games and write on scented tablets thrilling accounts of those exciting scenes, with the same hand that had applauded an assassination. There were fathers of families who would cry out vociferously, like the wounded gladiator should be struck again, that the wounded gladiator should be struck. They would cry out, fathers! And his dying frame hacked and cut to pieces by his triumphant opponent. And in an afternoon, you'd find women who could nurse their children the tenderness of paternal and maternal love. Then there was the tender, loving, sympathizing nature of women. Womanhood. Think about it. Blasted by the sight and thirst of blood. The noble lady and the Vestal Virgin, clothed in white and crowned with flowers, became furies in the theater and turned down the jeweled thumb for the murder of some fallen victim. Yet one felt all the ennobling ties of a wife, a mother, and a friend. And the other pretended to cultivate the Christian virtue of chastity. The Vestal Virgins are there to give their virginity to their gods, to keep themselves pure while they are voting and screaming and hollering for the murder of men, women, and children in the Colosseum. Yet one felt all the ennobling ties of a wife and a mother and a friend. This is the human nature without Christianity. This is the fallen nature of man, capable of anything without being saved by the grace of Almighty God, without being forgiven of your sins, without repentance toward God and faith toward our Lord Jesus Christ, without the Bible being the sole authority, the final authority, the King James Bible, the final authority of faith and practice, without that being your rule of life, the way that you live, then society and entertainment takes over, and it becomes the rule of life, and it is what you follow. These women were blasted by that. Alas, in this we see the human nature. Think of these refined women. Some business and others dressed in skirts or dresses or wedding dresses, or these women that you would work around or caring for a child. They were the victims of this heathenism, this terrible slavery in which the nations of the earth were held captive. We can pass in imagination from the carnage and the bloodshed of the Colosseum, the merciless massacre of women and children who exposed their infants on the banks of mountain torrents. You think about that. There are people that gave their babies to the gods to be murdered and to be destroyed. And then we have women that stand outside of abortion clinics. 4,000 babies a day are murdered. How could they do it? How could they watch your dog and murder their baby? You know, you have that, right? I have women on the streets when I talk to them. They watch animals. They pet sit. And they admit to aborting their own children, killing their own sons and daughters. This is the life that they live. This is what heathenism does. This is what happens when you do not like to retain God in your knowledge.